I think both of you are getting to the point that, all these government programs have changed our behavior. I mean, Americans don't save because they have these massive government retirement programs. So I'm with you. Let's phase out Social Security over the long run. That will give individual Americans a huge incentive to save. And if we reform the tax code and make it easier for them to save, that's the direction to go.
I want to go. We have to take a break. I want to come back because I want to start there with you, Stephen, because you and I have talked about helmets. Football helmets.
Yeah, it's very much like it's exactly the same issue. Yeah.
This is an amazing fact, and we'll be back in just a second. We're talking about making serious changes to Social Security and Medicare, and what would the changes look like for Americans? These are the kinds of questions that you really need to start thinking about. Chris Edwards, he is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and Stephen Dubner, author of Super Freakonomics. In a really weird parallel universe where I was president, he would be my main advisor.
Because I thought I'd get to run the NFL. That's all I wanted. All right.
I read Super Freakonomics and I think, well, that makes total sense. I don't like it. I don't want to believe that, but it makes total sense, so we should do that. Okay. And unfortunately, nobody in Washington thinks that way. We're trying to think today about Social Security and Medicare. We were talking before the break about football helmets, and we've had this conversation before. Football helmets actually cause more injuries.
More concussions, yeah. We invented a safety measure to stop a certain kind of problem, which were skull fractures. And we did pretty well. The new helmets do that well. What they do, however, is give players so much padding that they now use the head as a weapon and cause more injuries to other guys.
And we know that because of, what is it, Australian football?
Well, Australian rules football and rugby don't use a helmet, so you can compare there, but you can also just look at the data within the NFL and see that there's been a huge behavior change. The point is, when rules are made, behavior changes. That's what we do. We're animals. That's what we do. The point is, when you add safety measures or when you add a safety net, it changes behavior. So there's a new paper out today that says that people who have insurance, health insurance, and people who have the most generous health insurance plans are more likely to attain more body mass index. In other words, insurance can lead to obesity. Why? Because the problem's going to get taken care of. That's why. And so your behavior changes.
I will tell you that since Obamacare came in, I can't tell you the number of people that said, I got to change my eating habits because I don't want to ever go to the doctor. I don't want to ever have to need anything because I ain't going to be able to.
Well, that's the other thing. When you have health insurance and you have an all-you-can-eat health care plan, which most people who have health care do, what do? They consume more. And that's a big problem.
Right.
That's what the costs are all about. And they crowd out the sick.
So how would you take on Medicare?
Well, Medicare, the costs are exploding. It's the single biggest financial threat to our nation's future. There's no doubt about it. Why are the costs exploding? Because tens of millions of elderly, they go to doctors and hospitals. They get essentially free service, so they demand more and more. The doctors and hospitals send the bills to Washington. Medicare has over $1 billion bills sent to Washington every year, and they pour out $450 billion on this program. And it's sort of like a Soviet-style top-down Washington program, shoveling out the money. There's 7,000 different price controls in Medicare, and the basic problem is people are demanding too much. So the solution is you go to an individually based consumer system. Someone hits the age of 65, you give them a federal $11,000 voucher. They can go and buy health insurance in the private market if they want. That will help them. That will encourage them to be good consumers, like they're good consumers when they go buy a new car or any other product. So the money's got to go to the consumer and empower that person.
That's the problem, isn't it, with everything that I mean...
Yes.
The doctors, my evidence of this is doctors, if they're ever writing you a prescription, they'll always do this. Do you have insurance? And you say yes, and they'll say, okay, great. Or if you say no, they'll say, all right then. I mean, they make the choice right there.
I think it is amazing that we think right now that the problem is that there's too little health care to go around. And I would argue, I think you could make a strong argument that the problem really is that there's too much health care going around and it's going to too few people. Right now, Americans' out-of-pocket medical spending is 12%. That's all we're paying for, 12% on the dollar, okay? Switzerland, which we think of as a kind of much more progressive government, 30%. When you pay for what you get, it changes your behavior.
That's why we should have, first of all, take the employer out of it. It's got to be
Yeah.
with you. You have to be the person that says, you have to be an informed consumer. I don't know, Doc, do I need that? Now, there are times that you say, I don't have any idea what I'm talking about.
Right.
Fix my leg. You know what I mean? But you have to be an informed consumer. And also, if we would cap that, do that with making sure that you can't sue for absolutely everything, have
Right.
some sort of responsibility for anybody who's suing for anything. I think England does this, don't they?
Yeah, I don't know, but the thing about insurance tied to the employer is also the fact, think of the drag on the economy, because people get in what's called a job lock, right?
Yeah,
When you
yeah.
have insurance and you have a pre-existing condition, what does that do to the economy? Everything we like about this economy, it's innovative, it's
Right.
mobile, that starts to go away.
Okay, back in just a second. Back with Chris Edwards, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and Stephen Dubner, author of Super Freakonomics. Thanks for both of you guys being here. Well, I want to talk a little bit about fraud in Medicare, because it's as high as 20% of the entire budget. That's an outrage.
It's incredible. Medicare, we spend $450 billion a year on it. As much as 20% of that money simply goes down the drain. Basically, because Medicare processes over a billion claims every year for services from hospitals and doctors, all these claims are just paid by computer. So if you have a laptop and you submit forms to Medicare, you can get reimbursement, and they might or might not catch you. There was an interesting story last year covered by the Washington Post that this high school dropout in Miami submitted over 100,000 claims to Medicare, and she netted $100 million from the federal program before she was caught.
Stephen.
That's better than being a TV host. 105.
Yeah, she'd be on the cover of Forbes. What, you think out of the box, and that's what these people do. I mean, they every time, bad guys, that's what they do. They just think of ways to beat the system.
Yes, that's right.
So, I mean, you think out of the box. We need somebody like you to look at fraud.
Or we need someone like my co-author Steve Levitt, who is really a genius at taking a gigantic pile of data and trying to think. Here's what you got to do. You have to think like a cheater. And that's what, look, our government, let's give them credit where credit is due. Our government can be very, very good at law and order. Our government has been pretty damn good at anti-terrorism in the last several years.
Yeah.
No question. And every time we don't hear about it is another mark of success. That said, they don't employ enough people like my co-author Levitt, who really understands the mind of a cheater. And what you do is you learn to look at data in a new way. We did it in Super Freak. We wrote about it. We worked with a British bank to look for terrorists in their retail banking data. In our first book, we wrote about catching cheating teachers. No child left behind. We like the idea. Make people accountable. You know what else it did, though? It changed teachers' behaviors. All of a sudden, they had more responsibility. They started cheating. How do you find them? In the data, you look for patterns. For instance, you'll see a kid will fill in 30 questions and leave 10 blank. Then lo and behold, they'll fill in the last 10, and they got all the last 10 correct. Well, that wasn't the student, that was the teacher. But until you learn to think like a cheater,
Holy
think like
cow.
a fraud, you can't do it.
All right, back in just a second. Final thoughts. Tomorrow we abolish the Department of Education. Remember, use truth as your anvil, nonviolence as your hammer. As Gandhi said, anything that doesn't stand the test when it's brought to the anvil of truth and hammered with nonviolence, reject it. We'll see you tomorrow from New York. Good night, America.